Let's go back in time, to the turn of the 20th century. It was a period of such massive upheaval that it kicked off one of the largest human migrations in all of history. For millions of Italians, the choice was brutal. Stay and face a life of struggle, or risk absolutely everything for a shot at a new beginning on the other side of the ocean.
24 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many Italians packed up and left their homeland between 1870 and 1970. I mean, this wasn't just a few families looking for a better job. This was a whole nation on the move, a diaspora on an epic scale.
But what did it really take to join this exodus? It was so much more than just packing a suitcase. For millions, the journey was an absolute ordeal that started long before they ever even saw the ship. So let's dig in and uncover the true price of that one-way ticket to a new world.
You know, for most people, this journey didn't start with excitement or a sense of adventure. It started with a heavy heart. That moment of departure was filled with this incredible sadness and desperation, with just the tiniest glimmer of hope for something better.
For so many families, the very first step toward America was an unbelievable sacrifice. They had to sell everything they had just to afford the ticket. We're talking about the family mule, the vineyard that had been in the family for generations, even the very house they lived in. They literally walked onto these ships with almost nothing but the clothes on their backs.
On board, these ships became these incredible floating patchworks of Italy. You had people from the hills of Piedmont suddenly becoming neighbors with folks from the sunny coasts of Sicily, and for so many of them, farmers who'd never left their small inland villages, this was the very first time they'd ever seen the ocean, this huge, terrifying thing that was now their only way out.
And this is the moment, right? As they stepped onto that ship, any dream of a new life immediately collided with the brutal reality of the voyage. And that reality, it set in pretty much the second they got on board.
So, the first thing that happens, their few remaining possessions were taken from them. Whatever little trunks they had were locked away in what was called the bagagliera, the ship's baggage hold. And just like that, they were sentenced to spend weeks in the exact same clothes, which, as you can imagine, quickly became disgusting, caked with sea salt, food, and, well, human waste.
Now, you'd probably assume there were at least some regulations to protect people in this situation. And you'd be right, on paper anyway. There was actually a royal decree from 1901 that set minimum bunk sizes. It was a gesture, I guess, towards some basic level of decency. But the actual reality? According to people who were there, like the ship's doctor Teodorico Rosati, it was a complete nightmare. He said that the feeling of disgust you got from going down into the hold was so powerful that if you experienced it just once, you would never, ever forget it.
And the details of that nightmare are just horrifying. We're talking hundreds of people crammed together, sleeping in their clothes and shoes. The bunks were filthy, crawling with insects. The air was thick and stale. There was barely any light. And to make it all so much worse, families were separated. Boys and girls over the age of 7 were split up from their parents.
And look, the horror wasn't just confined to the sleeping quarters. For a third-class passenger, every single moment of every day was a fight for survival, a struggle to hold on to even a tiny piece of their dignity.
Just try to imagine this: 1,500 people, and not one single bath. The writer Edmondo de Amicis documented this, noting that the total lack of hygiene, especially on those long winter voyages where everyone was trapped below deck, created a stench and a level of filth that is just, it's hard to even wrap your head around it.
Mealtimes didn't offer any relief. Dr. Rosati described his heartbreaking scene of passengers just squatting on the dirty deck to eat, balancing their plates on their laps. He said they looked like beggars waiting for handouts, a daily reminder of how they were being treated. And this comparison just lays it out so clearly. It really illustrates the massive social gap on these ships. I mean, just a few decks up, first and second class passengers were having these fancy meals at tables with tablecloths and real silverware. It was literally two different worlds on the very same boat, separated by a huge wall of class. But look, surviving this crossing was about more than just putting up with the filth. It was a daily battle against disease, being on constant alert for violence and theft, and just generally dealing with the dangers of the open sea. These crowded, filthy conditions were the perfect breeding ground for disease. Sickness just tore through the dormitories. On one single voyage in 1905, the ship Città di Torino reported that nearly 50 people died, just from things like typhoid, bronchitis, and measles. This timeline really puts it into perspective, showing just how deadly these crossings were and how ridiculously slow things were to change. In 1884, A ship with cholera victims was actually fired on with cannons to keep it from docking. It took another 11 years before they made it mandatory to even have a doctor on board. So who was in charge of this floating chaos? Well, there was a guy called the Royal Commissioner, and he basically acted as the police, the judge, and the jury. It was his job to stop the constant brawls, the thefts, the illegal gambling, everything that festers when people are in such desperate conditions. He was even breaking up stabbings between rival gangs.
But way down in the fiery belly of the ship, totally hidden from the passengers, there was a whole other crew working one of the most dangerous jobs you can imagine. These were the forcisti, the firemen, and it was their brutal, back-breaking work that fed the coal furnaces that pushed the ship across the ocean.
And their life was, frankly, a living hell. They worked grueling 16-hour shifts, shoveling coal in this suffocating, intense heat. When storms hit, they were at risk of being thrown against the red-hot boiler doors. They lived with the constant danger of explosive flame blowbacks, and their sleeping quarters were right next to the scorching engine.
So when you start to piece all of this together, the unbelievable filth, the rampant disease, the crime, the soul-crushing labor, it's so clear that this wasn't just a trip. This was a perilous odyssey. It was a true test of human endurance against just unimaginable odds. The writer, De Amicis, he really summed up the tragedy of it all perfectly. He basically said that you can't just excuse this level of suffering by saying, oh, well, things used to be even worse. That's no excuse. He insisted that the sheer scale of the misery he saw was a deep and undeniable human tragedy.
This whole harrowing experience, this was the price of hope a little over a century ago, and it really forces us to ask a tough question. When we look at people today who are still making dangerous journeys, all in search of a better future, how has their struggle changed? And in what heartbreaking ways has it stayed tragically and undeniably the same?